outage scenario.
Right. Yeah.
And took up a lot of people's time here, and the communication wasn't as great as it could have been. Not internally. Our communication was fine because we were all here,
vendor?
but yeah, vendor communication wasn't great.
Right.
Which is.
But that's an issue you've known about that particular vendor for a long time, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So the show notes for today, we're not mentioning vendors, right?
No, I don't think this is specific to any one person. I think current events have brought this topic to the forefront, but I don't think any one particular person should be identified.
Named and shamed.
Yeah.
I mean, it could happen to anybody.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that outages happen. Doesn't matter who you are or what you are. They're almost unavoidable.
I've had outages before that were actually not related to any vendor. They were due to and I think I note this in one of the notes. It was due to a bad node on the network. So like traffic was being routed from Rhode Island through like an ISP in Pennsylvania, and that ISP had like a bad node on their network, and it was just destroying the connectivity from the Northeast to this web server that was down in.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about BGP. I mean, BGP is kind of where
Nick is wicked loud. Is Nick not wicked loud for everybody else?
Yeah.
Let me see if Zoom turned that setting back on.
Yeah, if you lock it and just take it down a few notches.
My ears are bleeding now.
It is audio. It is at its minimum input volume.
No, it's not right. So what are you looking at, Zoom? Take a look at go into Linux. You're in the Linux. Go in and look at the input settings on the audio.
Did you just say
last time I did that? Last time I did that, it changed my output device too.
It shouldn't. You should be okay. What
it is? Wait, is it using this microphone?
Yep.
I'm on.
Are you Ubuntu?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's at 100%. How's that?
Yeah. Tune it down.
Is that better?
I
just cut it in half.
Yeah.
Test.
Yeah, it's not blasting, right? Like it was. You agree, John?
Yeah, I think it's okay. Yeah.
It's not registering at all on the gain right now.
No, it's actually fine. It's coming through fine.
It's weird because I think Steven's still a little bit low and you're still a little bit high. So I'm like trying to find the midpoint as to where I can.
Yeah, so that's interesting you say that. Nick, do I sound okay to you?
You sound okay, but I think you're a little softer than usual.
All right, so let me try to boost that myself.
I think one of the things is I have noise canceling headphones, so it's easier for me to hear.
How about now?
Yeah.
A little louder.
Better?
That's good.
Mm-hmm. All right, good.
You can hear everybody at a normal level now.
All right. Super show notes. Thanks, guys. Nick, you see you're leading today.
Yep.
Feel free to adjust any of those words that we have here.
238. Outages all in. Make sure you scream that. Outages!
So I fixed the left channel only on YouTube.
Okay.
I created a second video because you can't replace a video that's already up there.
That's what I learned about Mario Maker yesterday too.
What?
Oh yeah, same issue, right?
Once you upload the level, so you can copy the level,
yeah.
But you can't then copy the level, make changes, and upload it. Because some people played over the weekend. Apparently, more than I think 700 people have played now.
Really?
And nobody's beat it.
So on YouTube, you can't update a video. You have to delete it or take it down and then re-upload it.
Yep. So what I decided to do is, because you can't change the core content after it's been loaded. You can change the metadata, but you can't change the core content.
So what was wrong with the video in the first place?
So this is weird. I noticed the video when I exported the video the first time last week, because I tried to do all this last Friday, and maybe I was just delirious when I did it. There was audio only coming from the left channel, from the left ear, left speaker. Mm-hmm. And I thought I fixed it. And I did fix it. Like I went back to the video file, I fixed it, but I must have uploaded the wrong video file to YouTube. The one that had only left channel, not stereo channels. So that went up on Friday. I noticed it yesterday morning, I think. Nick texted me yesterday and said, hey, left channel is the only one playing. So instead of deleting it, because we already had a number of views on it, what I decided to do was I updated that metadata to say, hey, only the left channel is working. If you want to hear this right, go to this video. And I have a second video called Fixed. And then I updated our Talking Drupal page to point to the correct video. So
that's the exact same thing I dealt with Mario Maker. Because like, I don't want to lose all those plays. And I wanted to have a harder version.
I didn't want to lose the 25 views.
But we have, yeah, I mean, 700, there's 700 deaths in that level right now. Not one person.
It should really allow you to upload a new one and then just say like corrected or something like that.
Yeah, it's weird. It doesn't do that.
It's probably to prevent bait and switch. I mean, people put stuff up, get 1 million views, and then put something offensive.
Change the content, yeah. Because they can't really audit what's in the video necessarily. Well,
I don't believe that at this point.
They do. No, they do audit the video content, yeah. Like if I put like copyrighted music in there, this thing would disappear in 24 hours.
I think it's faster than that. If it depends if it's Disney or not. If it's Disney, it's Disney will be copyright removed in 30 seconds.
Right.
But yeah,
which is fascinating to think about how they do that. Right? Are they looking for digital signatures?
Yeah, it's basically
it's interesting, right?
They're using something called Fourier transforms, I think, so that you can basically do an audio fingerprint. That's how things like Shazam work.
Right.
Right. So you can get it
kind of thing, right? A digital print of the.
And the funny thing about Shazam is, I tested this maybe 2 or 3 years ago. If you have a song that's a remix, so it's playing another part of the song in it, and you have it listen just to the part of the song that is playing, many times Shazam will still get it correct. Like it'll give you the song it won't give you the original song, it will give you the remix, which blows my mind.
Well, I watch a lot of music videos on YouTube, a lot of musicians. So they will, and I've learned that even if they play like guitar parts, so just a guitar part from a popular song that is copyrighted that they're not supposed to share on YouTube, that video will be pulled down. So it's not like they even copied the music from the CD.
Yeah.
They just play a guitar part more than like 15 seconds from a song that the artist wants pulled down. It comes down. It's really amazing.
That's one of the problems with some of this. I mean, there's stories of people like there was, I forget exactly what it was, but somebody came up with some sketch or skit or song on YouTube, put it up. Somebody else produced it and put it on like SNL or something, and then a week later the original video got taken down. It's like it's his original content. You can't. Well, he's the one that owns the copyright.
I know, Twit on This Week in Tech, they had an issue with one of their shows. I guess they ended up getting them blocked from YouTube for a little bit, and they were like, "But it's fair use. We're like a news program," and they had to get into they had to get into it with YouTube, and I'm like, oh man, like it's rough. Like I get people wanting to protect their creative license or their personal property and stuff like that. But I don't know. With all this machine learning, you would think we'd be able to do a better job.
I think we're doing.
They can, but it doesn't pay to. They can do a better job. They just don't want to because. They don't care. It's like Happy Birthday. One of the reasons why restaurants for many, many, many years or still sing not Happy Birthday, but some random weird song is Happy Birthday. The song was copywritten. So you had to pay license fees to use it.
Not anymore, right?
Well, something like 5 or 10 years ago.
Fell off a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it fell off a couple of years ago, but it fell off 2 years before the company admitted it did. Before somebody finally sued them, and they said, "Oh yeah, I guess we don't own the copyright anymore." Right. And so a judge they made something like $10 million over the 2 years that they had licensing it, And the judge was like, well, we can't figure out what the damages are. You just have to pay a fine of $2 million. It's like, what do you mean you can't find out how much the damages are? People paid them licensing fees in those 2 years.
Right.
The damages at the minimum are whatever they made on that happy birthday. And if they can't determine what they made on it, then how are they charging people license fees for that?
God bless America.
But yeah, it's kind of crazy sometimes.
All right, let's go to
Steve, you now owe Betsy Ross some royalties.
Yeah.
Which, to be fair, I know. Don't send me angry grams. I know Betsy Ross didn't create God Bless America. Don't do it.
So who did?
Okay.
That's a great question. I'm sure the internet will help me. Nick?
Vivo.
What? No.
That's the modern world, right? Vivo created everything.
I think Katie Smith, according to Google.
Who?
But Katie Smith?
Katie Smith. Okay.
That can't be. Is that right?
Doesn't sound right, but hey, what do I know?
I mean,
I
I
think that's someone who sang it. I don't know if that's the person who wrote it.
Oh, no, Irving Berlin. Yeah.
There it is.
That sounds better. Okay.
That's the guy.
Yeah, she was the first person. She was famous for singing it.
Yes, exactly. Right. Okay. Because wasn't she recently stopped? Her rendition was recently stopped from Yankee Stadium.
I have no idea.
Yeah. Katie.
I don't know anything about her.
I guess we don't need to go there. So we'll start the show.
Okay.
All right, guys.
You guys ready?
So hang on one second. Let's give a pause here. Whenever you're ready.
This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 238, Outages. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we preempt our planned topic to discuss outages because we had one. First, let's catch up with everyone. John, what's new with you?
Super busy, working on a whole bunch of different projects, enjoying every minute of it. But I wanted to take this opportunity, because we're talking about outages, to say, hey, you know what? Sometimes, even in an outage, you need to take a break and you need to take a walk. I had a coworker yesterday. We were dealing with an outage, and they were, frustrated, kind of stressed out. They had a lot going on. There wasn't a whole ton that they could do, except just kind of like keep the flow of communication going. And they were like, oh, it's so nice out. I'd like to go take a walk. And I'm like, you know what? You should go do that. And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, listen, take your phone with you. If something changes or you need to come back, like, we can call you, not a big deal. And they were like, yeah, I guess you're right. Okay. They went out and took a walk. When they got back, the issue was resolved, and they were able to, continue communicating to the team and to the client. And their stress level was decreased quite a bit. Right. I'm not saying that every time you go to take a walk, your problem's magically going to fix itself. But I will say that as people in technology, mostly sometimes this happens to developers, you put something down and you go do something else. And 9 times out of 10, you'll go, while you're doing that other thing, you'll go, oh, I know what the problem is here. I know how to fix this. And you'll be able to resolve it. So I'd like to start off by saying, take a walk.
So it's interesting because I think all of our topics today, as I'm looking at the list here of things we're going to talk about, are all very related and connected to exercise in some way. Right? Someone went out, did a little bit of exercise, you clear your head, you move on. And my notes for today was like, hey, what's happened this past week? I feel like I'm in the weeds. Like for the past week and a half, I feel like, things are out of control. I'm out of my comfort zone. I am working on things that I'm not used to working on and not comfortable working on. So it builds up that pressure. I just spent 3 hours this morning working on a Docker Postgres container issue. Those things kind of build up on you. And I'm sort of interested and glad, John, you brought up the walk thing, because about an hour and a half ago, I left my office and said, I'm going to go for a 15-minute walk because I need to clear my head. I got a lot of stuff going on this afternoon, and it was just a great way to sort of reset myself for my afternoon. So, yeah, I'm in the weeds, and John's recommendation of walking has helped me. How about you, Nick?
That's so funny because we don't actually coordinate these catch up. I mean, we coordinate the show obviously, but we don't coordinate these little weekly catch up topics. But over the weekend, my wife and I joined a gym again. I mean, we'd been members of a gym for a long time and kind of just stopped going. We found a new gym in the area that kind of suits our needs a little bit better. So I've been sore the last few days, but I feel a lot better. It's nice to get a workout in. We did a yoga class yesterday, which was significantly more difficult than I was expecting. But yeah, it's good to kind of focus on, my health again, and not really a New Year's resolution, but looking forward to getting more fit. So we've got a couple of stories this week. The first one is about the HTML title module. I think I've only ever used this one once.
So I put this in the show notes because I saw this come through this week as a new module that was at like its first official release in Drupal 8. It's like the 1.0 release of this module. And it got me thinking about, so this module is HTML title. It's a module where it allows you to go in and put HTML content, like tags, like some basic tags, into the title field. And it got me wondering, what is the use case for this? Because I know in the past being a long time ago for me, like if I went back like 5-6 years ago, I felt like I used this in Drupal 7. And it was probably because I didn't know better. And I was wondering if you guys thought there was a use case for HTML in a title tag.
So my immediate response here,
yeah, I can see John. If you're not watching the video,
I'm
John's
shaking my
arms are up in the
head.
air.
I'm shaking my head vehemently, and I just remembered we're back on video now, so people are going to see that, which is fine. But okay, so I was very much like, as Stephen was talking, like absolutely not, and then I thought about it a little bit more. So here's where I came down, right? Absolutely not, because your theme should be controlling the style of your title. However, in some instances, you may want your style of your title to include a bolded word or a word that has a different color in the middle of it. And natively, that is literally impossible to do unless you develop some sort of code to count how many words or what words or something like that, right? So this module can be used to allow you to put a span around something, I'm imagining, bold something, I'm imagining. So there could lie the use case for that. If you had that.
It was visually styling, not semantic.
Yeah, I don't think you can do spans.
Yeah.
Oh, really? So it would have to be the bold tag, which still could be okay, because you could say, hey, bold this word, bold this word and make it a different color. Like that could be part of the style. But what I would say is don't try to overuse the module where you're like putting a ton of HTML markup in the title for not a good reason.
It's interesting to me because, like I said, I've only used it once, and I think it's on a project that I didn't install it on. I think it was a project that I was working on within another agency, and I can see the utility, like John was saying, the ability to just tweak an internal word of a title. But I just gotta wonder how much complication that adds, because the title field is kind of the one remaining special thing on nodes.
Entity. Yeah.
Yeah, like the body field used to be weird. You know, a bunch of different things were weird about different entities, but the title field, I think, is still the only like required field. And I just wonder how, like, you're changing a fundamental. I wonder if it just kind of hides. I'm gonna have to take a look at the code because I wonder if it kind of just hides the field.
Yeah, we probably should have tested it before we talked about it, but I think what it's doing is I think it's like adding a new filter to the title field and allowing you to put in HTML content that's filtered to some basic formatting tags. That's my impression. So the reason why I put it here is I think people should know about it because it's there, because there is these really unique use cases for it. And I know I've used it in the past, but when I wrote this, I couldn't remember, other than bolding something, I couldn't remember where it was useful.
It's actually a really.
It sounds like you guys are in the same place I am. Is that maybe some basic formatting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only place that you even could use it. I mean, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't really provide. It provides a couple of interesting tags, but doesn't provide a whole lot. Like, it allows the code tag, the bold tag, the EM tag.
Right. Basic formatting. So we also the next story here is Drush 10. So this is a follow-up from our last episode where we posted a blog post that said, hey, what are the origins of Drush? And I'm just posting this here and reminding people there's a follow-up to that article that is, hey, this is where Drush was in the past, and this is where it's going in the future. So it's worth taking a look at. The link is in the show notes. It touches on some of the things that are related to 8.8 in Drupal and goes down the avenue of says, should Drush be in Drupal core? It's a great question, and they try to address that in this blog post a little bit. So go take a look at it.
I wonder if the Drupal console people will have an opinion on that. I'm sure they will.
Interesting you bring that up, John, because this article also touches on the differences between Drush and Drupal console and when you should look at one or the other.
Super useful.
So go take a look at it. Link in the show notes. The last thing that we have in the stories here is I've noted, and this is an observation by me because I have some RSS feeds that I use daily, weekly to pull in to articles we want to talk about. I've seen a trend happening over the past 3 or 4 months that a year and a half ago, most of the stuff in my Drupal feeds and RSS feeds related to Drupal were videos. All video content, almost like 95% videos. I'm starting to see a trend that people are starting to write more, that there's more blog posts that are long form, instructional blog posts that are written. And I just wanted to say, hey, if you're interested in long form posts that aren't videos, so things you can read and kind of dig into a little bit, which is the things I love. Subscribe to some of the, weekly drop and some of the feeds that come in from Drupal, or go look for yourself for RSS feeds. There are some companies out there. I didn't list them here, but top of mind is Lullabot, is doing some great posts. Hook 42 recently doing some great long form posts. There's a number of companies that are starting to write more content on their blogs about Drupal. So go take a look at them. I'll try to do a little research and come up with some more links for the show notes.
Stephen, what do you think the reasoning is for that? Is it more SEO friendly, or is it just getting kind of back into the list of things as opposed to shooting videos at people?
I mean, John, I don't know the answer to that. I love video content. I consume a lot of stuff from YouTube, but I also like the written form of stuff. I don't know there's definitely a trend changing, and I really don't know what the reason is.
It's probably also cheaper to produce.
We should start writing our podcast. Like weekly talking Drupal stories, weekly.
All right, John, you all just heard it. John just signed up for
that.
Stay tuned. It might be
means me.
It might be a couple of years before we get to that.
All right.
Okay, and so our primary topic this week, as we mentioned, is outages. So all three of us, and I'm sure everybody listening to the show, has experienced a site outage, whether it's your own or a client site. Some have been long and complicated, and others have been very short. Lately, as the internet gets more complicated, more interconnected, service outages have become more prevalent or more noticeable. This week's show, we're going to discuss what can be done to avoid them and what to do when one is occurring.
So currently, for those people that are listening to this in the future, GitHub is actually having some issues right now, and their
Really?
status page will update you as to what those issues are and how you may be seeing them. So that's a prime example of an outage that can affect your development and your site. But what types of other outages can affect your site, right? So I think the top three, or the top two for me at least, are a hosting outage or a third-party service. We just talked about GitHub. A CDN is another potential source of an outage. Are there any others that you can think of as far as integration points at which, if they fail, your website is going to be down?
To me, it almost feels like anything that I work with today is an outside vendor providing a service. Like, how much stuff do I even do locally?
Well, right. But you're also, that's a great point, because you're also not running that website from your local machine, right? You're making updates to it, sure. But ultimately, when an outage happens and your site is inaccessible, like that's, mostly related, in most cases, related to somebody else, right?
And it's also interesting because there's certain things that if there's an outage, it doesn't affect how much does the outage actually affect end user usability? So, if the web server is down, well, then nobody can get to the site and your site's down. If you have something that we talk about on the show a lot, if you have a translation service and your translation service has an outage, that's not going to affect your site uptime. Right. But it may affect a release of a particular important page or section or something like that. But typically that's not going to affect uptime.
Another great example along that line is search services, right? If you're using a third-party search utility or a hosted Solar instance somewhere, and that goes down, that could affect your site's ability to search. Again, not affecting your site's availability, but making it harder for your users to actually use your site.
And there's other things that you can do that actually sometimes mask outages and make it a little bit difficult. I had a client over the last year that they wanted to regionally locate some specific information for users, and so they would they utilize an IP lookup service, and obviously I had the discussion with them of how accurate those sometimes are or are not, but they basically they check the IP, see if they can get a zip code from it. If they can, they give something particularly relevant. If not, then they just rotate through a basic set of news. And so because of that, there's a fallback. So if the IP service goes down and we're not tracking that, there's no way to know that it's not even working unless you're from a specific zip code that has some sort of result that should show up. So some outages can be, some services can be written in such a way that an outage doesn't affect the end user in any way. It's kind of a progressive failure.
I mean, Cloudflare, for Cloudflare users out there, Cloudflare tries to load a cached version of your page to kind of give the appearance that your site is still up if something goes down. But even then, after a little while, sometimes that can fail to work. So
it's also not your vendors directly that you're using, right? It's also the vendors that your vendors are using. So how many services are we using that are relying on the Amazon platform to run?
Yeah.
Right.
Or, so, the Google platform. It's insane, right?
I mean, last year, I think it was, we're in February now, so it was definitely last year. But Amazon AWS had an issue, right? And it went down, and a large swath of the internet was just like, oh my God, what's happening? Our things aren't working. And, that's super disruptive, right? So, that leads into kind of our next topic is what can cause an outage, right? So I think in retrospect, that Amazon issue may have been tied back to like bad code, which is not actually in our list here, but bad code at the vendor level can cause an outage. The other thing, and this is more prevalent, right, is hardware. At some point, all of this stuff runs on hardware somewhere, and those things can fail.
The funny thing is, though, based on the way the cloud works now and the way most hosting vendors work, I can't remember the last time that an actual outage was due to like RAM dying or a hard drive failing. I mean, I've been working on this. I've been working on the web for 11 years, 12 years now. I know you guys have been at least as long. I don't remember, like, a hard drive has to have failed at some point during that time.
Well, so one of my clients. This actually brings me back to Jeff Geerling talk from what was it, last year's DrupalCon, I think, where he's talking about Kubernetes and how it can basically detect, oh, this hard drive just failed, switch over to this other, backup hard drive, like on the fly, to keep your network and your system up and running. So yeah, hardware failures are less prevalent, but still a hardware failure can cause data corruption. A hardware failure can cascade into other issues that can take down your site. We have a sub bullet here, database unavailability. So like with Drupal, everybody knows that it's running on a database. The second that database goes away or something goes wrong with it, it could cause an outage. Your site could be unavailable or broken. I'll just kind of go through these and then we can talk about them. A DDoS attack, right? Dedicated denial of service could be an issue where.
And that doesn't even have to be against your specific site. If you remember, I think a year and a half ago and 2 years before that, there was a very large scale attack against Cloudflare. They were using NTS and time servers in order to do a reflection attack, I think.
Was that Cloudflare or was it one of the DNS providers?
Nope, it was Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a DNS provider now, but this is before they did that. And they were at one point something like 30 gigabits of information were being thrown at them per second, and it was just bogging down the entire internet across the world. I mean, that day, Google.com was going slow for people, which is, insane when you think about it. But, a DDoS can affect that's affecting somebody near your site can affect your site as well.
So the next thing on our list is network issues and bad hops. Before the show, I was talking about how we had a website that was inaccessible from the New England region. And the reason for it was a node in the Philadelphia area was was bad, and the traffic going there wasn't getting routed properly. And for a whole region of the country, they couldn't access a certain website. So sometimes an outage can be not even related to you, your vendor, or your vendor's vendors. It can just be the internet isn't working the way it should. And then going down the list here, DNS, ISPs, and of course, continuous integration services can all lead to potential outages.
Yeah, so just to kind of reflect on those, DNS, obviously, if somebody puts in an incorrect DNS entry, then your site can go down. And the difficulty with DNS entries is many times they get cached for up to 48 hours. And so those issues can take, usually it's faster than that, but those issues can take some time to resolve even after you've fixed it. Or if it's a particularly secure site, then and you have the DNS locked down, making those changes can sometimes be a multi-hour process just to get permission.
That's right. I'm aging myself. I was thinking when you were talking about Cloudflare, I was thinking about Dyn DNS and their 2016 apocalyptic DDoS attack.
Yeah, no, Dyn DNS that was a different attack. But I think a similar mechanism.
So we've kind of scared everybody, and everybody's like super frightened now that their site's going to go down. So why don't we talk a little bit about how we prevent an outage?
Well, the truth is you can't prevent outages. You can't have 100% uptime. So part of it is preparing before an outage happens, preparing what the process is, who needs to be notified, and being realistic about how often an outage, how much outage is acceptable in a given period of time. Setting up an SLA. Even as we mentioned, even AWS has outages. In fact, AWS's status page had an outage a couple of years ago because their outage was S3, and that's where they stored their status, and so they couldn't update the fact that they were having an outage. And so if it happens, Amazon obviously has some of the best engineers on the planet. And so if it can happen there, then it can happen anywhere.
But to be fair, it is true that you can't prevent an outage, right? At some point, something is going to take down your website. But I like to think like having procedures in place to deal with those events, right? Testing those procedures to make sure that they're still relevant, running regular tests, and then working with reliable vendors. We talk about hardware, right? Not being an issue as much as it was in like the early days of the internet. But that's because we're working with great vendors. If we were, I remember early on, like still in college, I was hosting with a vendor, and we picked the vendor based on price because we were college kids, right? And one day the website just stopped working, and we had, we were kind of doing a little bit of freelance. So we had some clients on that server, and, calling the guy every day, like, what's going on? And he's like, yeah, the hard drive failed, and I ordered a new one, but I don't have it yet. And and at one point, this is where it got really bad, is like his mom answered the phone. And I was like, whoa, who are you? What? He's like, oh no, Jimmy's not home right now. And I'm like, what? I'm like, oh my God, who is this? So picking good vendors is super, super important.
We don't live in that world anymore, John. I mean, I was the Jimmy at some point in time in my life, but we don't live in that world anymore, right?
I would like to think that we don't, but I would imagine that there are, as with anything, there are different levels of vendors out there. Nowadays, you can get really reliable, cheap hosting. So, the Jimmys of the world are becoming less relevant, but I would say they still exist.
Yeah, and I think it's a discussion that you have with your client. about what an acceptable level of outage
Hey
is
Nick,
and what the
hey
cost
Nick,
is.
but let's just say this right now. If any of our listeners are using Jimmy, please unsubscribe to this podcast at this point, right?
I
You know,
I would say,
Or keep
if you're a
subscribing
host
and find new hosting.
and
no, that's
come
not,
on the
all right.
come on the show and tell us why you're
Okay, all
using
right.
Jimmy in
That's fair.
2020.
That's
Um,
fair. Okay.
but just to give a more realistic example, maybe I have some clients that are smaller businesses. They need to have a website because it's 2020. They're electricians, they're plumbers, and they're hosted essentially. They're hosted on Media Temple. At Media Temple, they have a virtual private server. Media Temple typically has one outage a year, and it's usually 6 to 8 hours. But the clients are paying, a significantly reduced rate of what they would be paying if they were hosting themselves or if they were on AWS or something that needed to be managed.
Their business is not, their website is not critical part
the
of what their
business.
business is. So they, when you're looking at outages, you can, as a business, make a decision to say, hey, I'm willing to deal with this number of outages or this amount of downtime based on what I'm paying.
Yeah.
In relation to how critical it is to my business running, right?
Well, and that's part of it, but also the amount of outages you have is important too. So, for example, previous to that, I think for a couple of years, I was on a provider called HostGator, I think, and it was the same thing. The cost was similar, the service was similar, the clients that were on HostGator were similar.
Was it HostGator or Big Orange?
No, I was on both of those, but HostGator, I think, had a 16-hour outage at one point, and they basically said, "Oh yeah, sorry, it won't happen again." And then 2 weeks later, had a 12-hour outage. And so, those clients' businesses weren't severely affected.
They were right, though. It wasn't 16 hours.
Yeah, but that's true. You got me there. But I migrated those clients to a new provider because that amount of downtime wasn't acceptable, and it wasn't something that I wanted to have to manage every few weeks. Talking to my clients about having an outage, what the issue was, what needed to happen.
That's an interesting point you bring up there, Nick. Is that the outage, like for your customer? I don't know what these websites were. Let's just say it's a brochureware website, right?
Yeah, they all were.
Yeah, they all were. Okay, so when you had an outage with them, it cost you time to deal with them, which was nowhere like the cost for you per hour, I'm guessing, is probably much greater than the time it took to deal with that problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that math make sense? What I just said?
I mean, it's more that
what I'm trying to say is it probably impacted you more than it impacted them.
Yes. And it was more that the dealing with the outage and checking it and communicating with clients took away from getting work done.
Right.
For the clients that was spelled out for the day. So it basically would set me back day and a half. And if that happened, if you get set back a day once a year, but you're not, you're paying $50 a month, well, that might be worth it, especially for brochureware clients. But if it's starting to happen once a month, well, 8 hours a month of lost productivity is significant and worth the investment to move. But then, there's another class of website where, I have clients that do commerce online, and, they're very public. The majority of the business is online. And if their site is down, they're losing thousands of dollars a day. They're not on the scale of Amazon where they're losing $500,000 a minute or something, but it's significant enough where they have downtime. They want to get back up immediately. They notice within minutes.
These are customers that have not, they're paying for serious hosting.
Yeah, and absolutely, and they have a different class of vendor. They're not on a Media Temple. Although I've certainly seen people with business critical websites on subpar hosting before, but yeah, they've got a usually they're on AWS or they're on Acquia or Pantheon. They're on a serious dedicated hosting vendor that has support, that understands business needs, has some sort of SLA, and will partner with the developer or the internal team if there's an outage to help resolve it. And in those cases, it makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense for, a plumber that has a 3-page website to spend, $5,000 a month in hosting.
Yeah. And if his website's down for 2 days, does it matter all that much? Probably not in the big picture for the cost.
Yeah. I mean, they need a website for email and to say that they have a website. Their website's not driving.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree. I don't think he's going to go out and get $5,000 hosting, but if his website's down for 2 days and he misses, 4 jobs out of that, that could potentially be maybe $1,000 for him that he's losing out on. Because, if I can't get to his website and I'm looking for a plumber, I'm going to go to the next guy's website whose website shows up. So, that makes you think a little bit. Maybe it's better to go to a company like Squarespace where, it's hosting integrated and like you don't have to worry about, I mean, they may still have outages, but if they have an outage, it's like top priority for them to get that back up and running. Right. So let's switch gears a little bit, right? We've talked about, what can cause an outage, different types of outages, how to possibly prevent an outage. But like, what do you do when an outage happens, right? Do you have a standard operating procedure that you follow? Who do you notify? Panic and run.
Pure panic.
Who do you notify and when? I know for us, we have a standard operating procedure that we follow. That goes through.
Describe that at a high level.
Yeah. So basically it's a list of things that we should do in the event of an outage. So, it basically starts off with, item 1, verify that there is actually an outage, right? You've noticed an outage. Is there actually an outage? Is it you? Is it the office? Is it, oh, okay, there is an outage. Like the whole world can't get to this website. And then 2, it's notifying, your internal team saying, hey, there's an outage, assigning a person to kind of run that outage and say like, you're the central point of contact. And then from there, it goes down to contacting vendors, contacting clients, and just opening lines of communication to figure out where the issue is and who's responsible for fixing it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good. I mean, the first thing is don't panic. You have to. You want to work through the issue. You want to make sure that you resolve it as quickly as possible. And so I think the first step is what you just said. You have to make sure that there really is an outage, and you have to confirm that multiple different ways. One thing is you have to check from outside your network. You want to make sure that it's not just the internet. You should check from a completely different device. I remember one time I was working on something and I noticed that a site was down, a particular site was down. It wasn't critical. It was a project that I was working on that wasn't yet live, but it wasn't coming up for some reason. And after 10 minutes, I realized that I was typing in the URL in a dyslexic manner, and I had transposed 2 characters. And then because I had done that, when I started typing it in, the autocomplete was autocompleting the transposed characters. And so the site wasn't actually down. I had just mistyped it. So going to the way I found that was I typed it on my phone.
And you were in panic mode probably.
Yeah. I mean, like I say, you don't want to panic, but there's always that moment of dread. Yeah. I think the second thing is that you really want, that's really important. And this is something that's been helpful for me, is you want to make sure you have something monitoring your servers. Ideally, you're the one that notices the outage, not your client. I'm not saying that you hide it from your client, but you want to at least do You don't. That's
you want to
bet.
be proactive, right?
Never,
you want to be
ever
be
hide it to your
proactive.
client.
You want to be able
Yeah.
to go to them and say, hey, there's an outage. We know about it. We're working on it. As opposed to them going like, hey, our website's down. You being like, oh, it is? Oh.
Yeah. You don't want to be like, I had no idea. And usually I want to spend 10 or 15 minutes before notifying, looking at it and seeing if it's a quick fix. And if it's a quick fix, fixing it and then notifying what happened and what the fix was.
It's interesting. We talk about panic, and I'm thinking of like points in which I would start to panic. And I think the only time that I really panic in that scenario is when I know that I've just pushed something or I've just done something and I'm like, and then something breaks and I'm just like,
was this my fault?
Oh no, what have I done? That can be panic inducing, but I agree. Yeah. Panicking doesn't really solve the problem.
In that case, I want to mention too, because one of the things, if you had just pushed something, one of the knee jerk reactions is too, like, I broke something. I need to roll back what we just changed.
Not always the best thing.
And
always
it could be a coincidence. Yeah, it could be a coincidence. So I think what the general process for me is confirm it's down a couple different ways, do a very quick pass, like I said, not more than 10, 15 minutes of looking at the issue, seeing if it's something I've seen before, see if I can quickly deduce where the outage is coming from, whether it's a vendor, it's the host. Usually I'll open a ticket proactively with whoever the host is, because if it's something company-wide or host-wide, they'll usually reply really quickly saying, hey, this is something we're looking into. And then, at that point, I will contact my client. So I'm curious about
Nick, the only change I would make to that, like that process that you're describing here, is that in my experiences with my customers is that the first step is to notify the customer and that something is up with the website and I'm looking into it, because maybe this is just my client base, is they often know sooner or at the same time that I do in that 15 minutes that I'm going to do some research that you're describing to figure it out. I want to let them know that I'm on it. Hey, I'm aware there's a problem. I'm looking into it is always my first communication. And
actually, now that you...
Then a follow-up would be, hey, this is what I found and I'm looking into it, but it's always to let them know that I know something's wrong.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting. For the clients of mine that are more technical, they have like an internal team that I'm working with, or it's an agency. I actually do notify them first. Right. For the clients where I am the sole developer or the main point of development, I'll usually do a quick thing, because the first question is, what's the issue? What's going on? And if I were to just say, hey, it's down, but I haven't looked at anything yet, they'll be like, well, why are you talking to me? If I can say it's down, I've opened a ticket with a client, with a hosting vendor.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It's related to this, then
it's based on your scenario.
Yeah. It depends on the type of client.
Yeah, I will say that our SOPs for this have timelines in them. So where, within the first 5 minutes, we're doing this. Within the first 10 minutes, we're doing this. We're spending 15 minutes doing this. We're checking in. It also has, and I just put this in our notes here, communication's key. So it also has communication points. What point do you communicate to the client, to the team, to vendors? And, most of our processes around communicating to the client or having a check-in with the client every 30 minutes to just make sure, like, hey, we're still working on this. Here's what we know so far. And depending on where the issue lives, right? You may not be able to do much of anything. So if it's something in your code or something that your team was doing and you may have to roll something back or update a patch, that's very much in your control. But looking at things with vendors. Hardware breaks. You don't have the ability to go somewhere and fix that hardware. You know, something in their environment stops working correctly. You are relying on them. So communication is super important.
So once the outage is over, then what? We got you're going to deal with the aftermath of the outage, and like, what are the things you're dealing with there? It's like, got postmortem, we've got like figuring out what happens, but the first priority is always, hey, we're back up and running. Then what do you do after that?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. In the immediate aftermath, when it comes back, you know, usually there's a heightened period of monitoring. Just making sure that it's actually back and not going to go down again in 10 minutes. You know, for example, if it's code issue, and you put something in that causes a race condition, and causes the CPU to spike and the site to just crash. You know, say for example, you created some sort of page that pulls every single node in the site and then loops through it 35 times for some reason and just crashes the site. You realize that and you put something on and say, hey, only do 10 at a time, right? You know, you put that fix up, the site comes back up. You want to keep an eye on it for the next little bit and make sure that it's not going to happen again. You want to make sure that's actually fixed.
That's a good point, Nick. I don't think we've ever, to this point, we haven't mentioned the fact that we actually caused the outage.
Yeah, sometimes you can.
Yeah, sometimes we cause the outage. So,
and I think
really
Nick's
about being transparent about what happened.
You know, I think Nick's point there earlier about like not automatically going to the rollback is true too. Because I've had instances where updates have gone out and they've been fine everywhere else, and then they get to production and something happens, and the client's like, "Should we roll back? Should we roll back?" And like, rolling back sounds great, but in reality, if an update has gone out, database updates have happened, and it's a site that has real-time interaction like e-commerce or people are signing up for accounts, rolling back can be very more disruptive. You know, in that instance, to Nick's point, like sometimes you'll do a quick search on Google and it says, "Hey, this is an issue," and you put out a patch, right, and everything works again, and you're like, "Oh," you're like, "Okay, cool, like right, awesome, I'm so happy about that." Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, to Nick's point, figuring out what happened, making testing, making sure everything is working is important, but finding out what happened is definitely getting to the bottom of it. Definitively, being able to say, this is what caused this. Once you have that information, then you need to go and update your procedures to avoid it happening again. We briefly had in our agenda here, I think we took it out due to time, talking about disaster recovery and when to switch over to a disaster recovery environment, right? You know, in your procedures, that should be a line item. Like, at what point do we do that? And it's something, you know, that we've encountered with outages. We've said, okay, we've been down for X number of hours. Like, do we need to switch over? But if you don't find out what happened, you can't update your procedures and then test those procedures to make sure that that change is actually going to be effective and help prevent this in the future, or help get your site back up in a timely fashion.
Sometimes it's not something that you can control, though. I mean, if a vendor has an outage like AWS, you know, you're not going to be able to control whether or not AWS has an outage. But one of the things that you can look at is replacing vendors. Like I mentioned, in my case, I had a client that, I mean, I was using a hosting provider that had 2 outages in like a month, 6 weeks, something like that. And I replaced them. John had mentioned a small orange, and I think they went out of business, and they just basically shut down all their servers with almost no notice. And I had a couple clients that were, you know, it wasn't a server that I hosted or managed, but they had a couple of servers there, and there was some fallout there. So sometimes just moving to a new vendor is something that you need to discuss.
Or looking at your vendor's infrastructure, right? So Nick had brought this up yesterday, I think, where he said, one of the hosting vendors that he works with uses multiple vendors on their back end. So if one vendor has an issue, they can pivot to another vendor, and their service stays solid, up and running. So that's important too. Looking at how, especially if it's one of these sites that's mission critical. If it's a big money maker for you, and if it's not up, you're losing thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. You need to look at all of these avenues to say, like, okay, is our infrastructure as good as it can be? Where's a single point of failure? That's definitely something you want to identify.
So part of the key after the outage is over is that post-mortem discussion to say, what happened, why did it happen, and how can we prevent this in the future? That could be switching vendors. It could be doing something different internally and making sure that your communication with your customers was where it should be after that process, because it's not a one-time thing. The outage happened today. It might not happen for 6 months or a year. Could happen 2 days later. So you want to be better at it the next time it happens.
Yeah. And I think one of the important things too to note is blame generally isn't important except in two cases. Like you're not looking to find out whose fault it was. You're not looking to shame anybody. The only two cases that I think blame is important is, and this is far after the fact, and one is if you find out that somebody did it intentionally, then obviously that's a very different case than just a generic outage. And I think the only other case is SLAs. I mean, if you have an SLA with a vendor and they didn't meet that SLA, right, then that's a discussion. And usually there's some sort of they provide you some sort of refund, or they have to update their infrastructure or something. But those are the only two reasons. I mean, you shouldn't be, if there's an outage, you shouldn't be looking like, whose fault is this? Oh, it was Nick's fault, and then hang him out to dry.
No,
it's more of the post-mortem is for what happened, how do we prevent it, and then at some point putting in those checks and balances to prevent it from happening again, or minimizing it, or minimizing the possibility of it happening again.
So the reason we had this discussion today is that there was an outage yesterday. So we're not here to discuss the vendor or put blame. So I'm interested any feedback you guys have on what happened yesterday. How did your organizations react to it?
I don't have any clients on that vendor, so I was spared. Right, although I did recommend that vendor fairly highly to a different client maybe 3 years ago. I'm kind of glad that they didn't go with them at this point.
Yeah, but outages happen. So, John, you were hit by this.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, at this point, the vendor had an issue, and they're still trying to determine whether it was a hardware issue or an issue with an individual or an issue with some software. They're
so not John, 24 hours later, their postmortem, they haven't been forthcoming in what happened, or they don't know.
They have been. They've given a good amount of detail as to what happened. Yep. Originally, they thought it was a hardware issue. Turned out that it was some sort of access rule.
So software configuration problem.
Some sort of software configuration. The question is still how that software configuration was removed, corrupted, or updated. So, yeah, I mean, ultimately at this point, we're still trying to figure out, get to the bottom of finding out what happened.
So you as a customer of the vendor, how do you feel about the transparency? The things we talked about today is like dealing with our customers. How do you feel that it's been working with that vendor?
So, I mean, I think in this instance, communication could have been a lot better.
Okay.
Just in looking at something like GitHub today, right? GitHub is experiencing an issue, and they come out and they say, hey, we know that there's an issue, we're looking into it. And then they say, we've identified the issue, we're working to recover from it. And then they update you.
This is separate from what you experienced yesterday, right?
Correct. So,
okay,
I mean, yesterday, I think the communication was very much like, yes, we know there's an issue and we're working to fix it. Okay, well, websites are dead in the water. Like, what's the timeline on that looking for? Like, and it's like,
how long?
We don't know. We don't know.
You know, it's interesting.
John, how long was the outage?
Just under 6 hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for a customer with mission critical website, that is a significant issue.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. And I think, when you're looking at it, it's hard to say. We've all been there. We've all been in a situation where we're like, we don't know what the problem. We don't know what the problem is. We don't know, where we're, how long it's going to take to fix this. We have a good idea, but we don't know. We don't know yet. So we've all been there. But I think in that instance, communication is super important. Being able to say hey, we've identified one possible problem. It should be 2 hours to get it fixed. If that doesn't fix the problem, then we have these other avenues we're going to go down. We're working with these folks to be able to say that, or to be able to resolve the issue. I think ultimately, getting we don't know when we're going to have this fixed. We are working on it, but we don't know when we're going to have this fixed after 2 hours is kind of is worrisome. I mean, I think lines of communication are super important in scenarios like this.
So your company, as a postmortem for this, would be doing a reevaluation of that relationship?
That's not necessarily accurate, because it's not 100% in our court. I think.
Gotcha. Yeah. Customers choose their.
I think
customers choose their vendors, right? Yeah.
And to be fair, my projects weren't directly affected by this. One of them was, but to a lesser extent. I think the team who was predominantly affected by this outage is going to do exactly what we suggested. Get the definitive answer as to what happened, look at the procedures that are in place, and then update those procedures to try to avoid this happening again in the future. And, I'm sure the vendor that we're working with will do the same and be more than happy to, accommodate in helping to test those procedures and so on and so forth.
Yeah, everyone's trying to do a good job. I mean, at the end of the day, right? You're trying to deliver good stuff. The vendor's trying to deliver good stuff. And I mean, sometimes shit happens.
Yep. Yeah. To Nick's point, blame doesn't solve the problem, right? Yep. And this stuff just happens sometimes. Nobody can anticipate. Think of your car. You're driving down the highway. Yeah. You can't anticipate your alternator going bad or something like that, right? It happens. It's not anybody's fault per se, but it's just how quickly you can get that fixed. That's the important part.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the actual detailed notes of what happened, it does look like it's one of those situations where it'd be difficult to mitigate. A fan died on a device. They brought it down to replace it. They replaced it. When they brought it back up, it deleted all its configuration, which prevented internal communication on the entire network. So
Nick, did you say a fan died?
A fan, a hardware fan. Yes.
So a single fan dying.
Well, a fan died on the core switch.
Okay, all right.
No, well, the fan dying didn't actually take it down. So the fan died, so the switch came down, which was fine. Yeah, they replaced the fan. I assume that they had a secondary switch actually. When they brought the broken one back up, though, it had a corrupt configuration file that probably copied over to the other one, and then they couldn't log in internally.
So we all think we're just building websites in Drupal and launching them, and then all these other things, fans dying, from a vendor affect what we're delivering to our customers?
Which is like a $5 part. How much productivity did that cost
Exactly.
all their customers and them? It's
too
it's
funny.
amazing
Well,
sometimes.
anyway, listen, if you have any questions or feedback on today's show or any other shows, you can reach out to us at Talking Drupal on Twitter, or you could email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. We love to get feedback there. You can also receive updates from us by a newsletter, and you can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
I'd like to thank our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. This pre-show was rather interesting. We talked about a large variety of topics, and as a patron, you get access to the raw footage of us talking about some of those topics before the show. So go to talkingdrupal.com and choose the Become a Patron button to sign up.
See you guys next week.
How about if we actually say goodbye to everybody first?
Oh, yeah. I saw we didn't have that in the show notes. I guess I'm
sorry. Yeah.
No, that's fine.
I take the blame.
No, there was something in my mind.
238 episodes, and we're still trying to get it right.
That's right.
There's something in the back of my mind. I'm like, we're missing something, but I just saw the close. So I was like, I guess I'll say goodbye.
I think that was an outage on my part.
Thanks for everybody's time. Nick, if people wanted to find you on the internet, where could they go about doing that?
I'm already gone. No, you can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And you can find me, Stephen Cross, at Stephen Cross on Twitter with a PH.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the social networks at John Picozzi, and you can find out about Umthink at umthink.com. Have a good one.
See ya. That was funny.
Nick,
well, you guys were silent, and I was like, "Wait, there's nothing left." So
I didn't think I needed to write that in here, but I guess I will.
Well, I mean, it says close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
but it says /newsletter. I don't know why, but
so I just dropped a note.
Yep.
Into the chat.
Yep.
I'm not sure. And yeah, I mean, I guess you can re-listen to it and see what it sounds like, but I'm not sure that we want to talk about the fan being the culprit, because ultimately they still don't know that was their initial assumption. But
but I mean, that's what they. I said that.
Yeah, I think that's fine as of now.
Because I said that's what they said. I mean, we know it's PR too, so.
It's PR, and it's also like the essence of these kinds of problems. It's not. I think we were very clear on saying we're not blaming people. It's just like shit happens. And
right.
A fan going out on a device could clearly take down 10% of the internet. I mean, that's reality. And there's this fragileness to the internet and to what we do.
And we didn't mention the vendor. So
the other side of that is that fan or the file corruption, right? Yep. Because maybe the fan going down caused the file corruption, or maybe somebody deleted it, or maybe whatever happened, right? That actually also prevented disaster recovery from being effective. So they
because they couldn't route things internally.
Well, are we still recording? Can we?
Yeah. Still on.
Probably want to.
This is post show, John.
No. Okay. If you want to hold on for a second, John, I do have a post show question for Steven, actually, that is appropriate for recording. If John doesn't want to talk about the vendor, did you get that? Did you hit that outage for FreshBooks? Do you still use FreshBooks?
Yeah. No,
but they don't have an easy way to back stuff up. So how do you back that information up?
I have never backed anything up from FreshBooks because I don't rely on them other than sending out invoices.
Oh, so you record all your information else.
All of our stuff comes back into our local system, and it gets imported into put into our accounting system.
Okay. Yeah.
FreshBooks is not the accounting system. It's not the source of record.
FreshBooks is not the accounting system. It's the interface to deal with customers.
Okay. FreshBooks is my source of truth. And so I back it up occasionally, but that's one, they haven't really released a feature in like the 5 years I've been using them. And the number one thing I want is a good way to like back stuff up you can export it, but it's manual.
Don't know.
All right. I was just curious about that. Okay.
Hey, am I still getting like benefit from using FreshBooks?
I don't think so. I think they changed it recently. So that I think they changed it like 2 years ago that you only get benefit for like a year or two.
Okay. I used to get like $30 a year or something for you using it.
Yeah, they increased their prices and they reduced their referral.
All right. Put that face on John.
So sorry, I'm reading a update on Drupal.org from the maintainer of the Lingotech module.
All right, so let's jump back to the fan thing a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, so the fan thing, right? So fan goes down, file potentially gets corrupted from fan, right? Yeah. Or maybe not. Maybe it just happened, somebody pushed some bad code, whatever, however that file got corrupted. Turns out that the DR segment for those guys is in Las Vegas, right?
Okay.
But in their Las Vegas data center, apparently it's not staffed. It's literally only staffed at night by like a couple of guys, like a small team.
DR. Yeah, it's DR, right? So it's basically an endpoint for copying things too, right?
Right. So because that piece of hardware went down or was inaccessible, they couldn't VPN into the disaster recovery segment to switch over to the disaster recovery segment. And they had to basically call up the guys that were assumingly sleeping because they probably have the reverse schedule of everybody else, right? And like have one of them go in to actually do the stuff that they needed to do to potentially even be able to use the disaster recovery segment. So like,
John, how do you know this?
Because that's what they told us on the phone when we were talking on the phone when we were talking to them.
So they were being transparent about that problem.
Hence the reason I'm not like totally willing to go like on the record and share that, because they were telling us this on the phone as a vendor, right? But you look at it and like you're just like, how does this single point of failure like totally cripple your whole network?
Why would they be going for the DR anyway? That's what
because we asked at what point should we switch over to the disaster recovery segment?
Right.
Because the two sites that we manage with them, one is
no names.
Yeah. No. One is a user, like users sign up. So it's the database is always changing. The other one is relatively static.
Right. So
that site, which was the more important of the two, could have easily been switched to the DR segment and been back up and running. But so we asked like, hey, what's the option for switching to DR? And the answer was well, here's the deal.
So the DR is not like the DR you anticipated it was.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is too, in most cases, even if you have a highly available system, there is a single point of failure. I mean, if you have a load balancer, if you have a load balancer, the load balancer is a single point of failure. You can have 500 servers behind it, but if the load balancer goes down.
Well, yeah, but typically you have multiple load balancers.
That's not typical.
It depends on how highly available you want your environment to be.
Yeah, I would say that like at the scale of some customer, 2 load balancers is.
So like for another customer of ours, right? They have Cloudflare in front of their site, and they very easily, for one of their sites, were able to redirect that domain to a page on another one of their websites. So that site, for all intents and purposes, came back up pretty quickly, and wasn't essentially, I mean, it was affected obviously, but like it wasn't down for as long as the other stuff was. So, I mean, I think, when back in the day when I used to do like this sort of thing for clients that wanted instantaneous failover and they never wanted their website to go down. Right. I mean, you were looking at architectures that had 2 load balancers, multiple webheads, multiple DB servers. And basically what was happening was like everything was redundant. There was no single point of failure. Granted, like, of course, the ISP coming in could have been a single point of failure, or like anything out of our control could have been. But from a hardware,
the core switch fan dying.
From a hardware perspective, everything was mirrored. So, I mean, there are instances where you can do that. It's just not.
So this scenario that happened, is that a way that you should be looking at vendors that are providing services on AWS and stuff? Because those kinds of things are rare. Like, would you expect a fan going out or some small item to bring a site down if you are on one of those larger?
No, but they also handle DNS different. Like AWS handles Route 53 like it's magic. So it's different. But also I'm of the opinion that disaster, like 6 hours is far too quick for disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is more like,
well, disaster recovery is like it's gone. Like like an earthquake happened,
it's not coming back.
Yeah.
But
but it's an interesting question though. But it's an interesting question though that John brings up, is to say, if I wanted to do a disaster recovery, I should be able to do it. It doesn't matter if there was an earthquake or not.
That's part of the reason. That's part of the reason in the show that I suggested testing, because ultimately, like, you can have the best plan in place, right? Like on paper, everything looks great. If you're not testing your plan and verifying that your vendor's testing their plan.
I think part of your disaster recovery needs to be that your disaster recovery isn't on the same vendor as the primary site. Your disaster recovery needs to be.
Well,
that's a really interesting topic.
So, but that kind of goes down another avenue, though, right? So, shouldn't the vendor be responsible for, like, hey, if we have an issue at this level, is that going to preclude us from being able to support our disaster recovery efforts?
You have to trust them.
Is that your service level agreement with them? I mean, that's what it comes down to, is what is the SLA for that customer?
I don't actually know. I mean, I know the SLA,
and you also don't
pretty high, but
you also don't have control over them. So you have to plan for the event. You have to plan for the event that even if they said that they're going to do something, I mean, that will get your client money back in court when they sue them, but it's not going to get their site back at the end of the day.
Well, right. But I mean, the way I'm looking at it is, like, from a vendor standpoint, if you want to say, hey, we're, so that vendor you were talking about the other day, Nick, that has different vendors for their hosting options, right? So, like, in this instance, I'm sure they're looking at it like, okay, if this data center just stopped working, right, what would happen? Okay, well, what would happen in the instance of yesterday? What would happen is that things would be very broken, in my opinion. I mean, I guess we would still have the option to switch DNS, but if the DNS is still going to that
Well, that's the thing. Like, I feel like DNS is the minimum thing for disaster. Like, true disaster recovery requires a DNS change, I would think, unless you're using
absolutely
like Cloudflare where you can change.
Yeah, that's
change it faster.
Well. So disaster recovery is not about switching in a minute. That's not what it's about. It's not about, hey, this is down, switch over to this in this instant.
Well, right. That's instantaneous failure.
Yeah. Disaster recovery is there has been a disaster. So there is a bandwidth of time that you say, hey, the site's not going to be available because of this disaster, but all of the stuff will be here when we get it back up in this certain period of time.
Right.
So DNS is not the critical thing.
Yeah. So wait. So
a DNS change.
Question, John.
A DNS change has to happen, but it's not critical.
Not the critical part of what disaster recovery is.
I'm curious now. What is your disaster recovery job? Like, you guys obviously have backups of that client's data. I mean, I know that's the case. I mean, at what point would you guys have pulled the trigger? Like, pretend that vendor basically just came back to you and said, yeah, we lost data. We don't know when it's coming back. I mean, you would be switching at this point, you'd be switching vendors, right? When do you,
it's not as easy. It's not as easy as that. So
if they came back to you yesterday at 3 p.m. and said, we still have no timeline coming back up. It looks like there's corruption. We're not going to be able to recover data. I mean, I can't imagine at this point you guys wouldn't be setting up a new host somewhere else.
Well, no. I mean, we'd be saying, hey, we need to switch to the disaster recovery segment. And if they were like, oh, that's gone. That's gone too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like doomsday scenario.
That's
not really
recovery.
Absolutely doomsday.
That's disaster recovery. Doomsday scenario is like World War III happened. And half the continent is gone.
But listen, no, it's not, because if one vendor is handling your hosting and your disaster recovery, and both of those things are blown off the map, like,
the only company that I would trust with that is AWS, and that's because you can specify which region you're in, so you can put your basic stuff in Virginia and everything else in Tokyo.
So we hosted, as you guys know, some bank sites for a number of years, and we had to have a disaster recovery plan. The disaster recovery plan had to cover if your hosting relationships ceased to exist. So none of the vendors
with no notice
today, with no notice, how long will it take to get the websites back up?
I see what you're saying.
That was what our disaster recovery, and we had a disaster recovery plan that was 72 hours that we had an SLA for, saying that the existing infrastructures and all of the stuff that we had ceased to exist. Did we have a plan to get things up in 72 hours?
But that in that instance, your customer was contracting with you, and you were contracting with the hosting company, correct?
Yeah. In that scenario, I was the hosting vendor, though.
Right.
I wasn't the software developer.
So we do have that, or the client does have that agreement. Yeah. I am not privy, because it's not my project. I'm not privy to what that agreement looks like.
Right.
Obviously our default mode of action is like, how can we get the site back up as quickly as possible? If it's going to another vendor, like, we're going to do it. No doubt.
I think for me, it's once you hit the 12-hour mark, that's when you start considering a vendor change. Right. And if it's 24 hours, definitely. You start changing.
It also depends, because with some corporate entities, it's hard to just pull a trigger on switching vendors like that, because lawyers have to get involved and contracts have to be signed, which can happen very quickly. I'm not saying that, but
that's not an immediate decision. That's hey, we've decided to move somewhere else. It could take us 6 months to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's if it comes back up. I mean, if the site doesn't come, if the vendor is truly gone.
Oh, well, that's disaster recovery at that point.
Yeah. That's what I was talking about. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting.
And I mean, to be fair, the site is co-located, but for whatever reason that didn't really
when
work
you delete
out.
your VLAN, I actually did that once. I accidentally deleted VLAN 1 or VLAN 0, I forget what it was. Everything stopped working. I had to factory reset the switch, the router, and set everything back up. It was not. I mean, it was just for my house, so it wasn't a deal.
So I'm looking at my messages here. John says we should do a show on horror stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Like I've got
my favorite horror story is Nick's.
Which one?
With the labels. No, with the printing of the zip code book.
Oh God, I never want to think about that again.
Okay,
did I tell you that
my favorite horror story is Nick's.
So
he contacted me like 6 months after that whole situation, asking me to update his website. Yeah, and then again like a year later, I was
we
like,
ever talked about that on the show?
I don't remember.
I don't know if we did.
That was embarrassing.
The worst
I remember having
ever.
a client come to me, or come to the company I was working for, and their old developer had AdWords campaigns running on their website, and he was profiting from them, but the AdWords campaigns were for their competitors.
Oh God.
So like you'd go to that
advertising their competitors on their own website.
Yep. And I just remember being like, what? Like, you got to tell him to take those off of there. And they're like, well, he won't answer our calls. He won't respond back to us. I'm like, what? Oh yeah.
I think Google's gotten better at not doing that, but that's kind of funny.
All right.
Yes.
Time to end the day.
I'll catch you guys later.
Thanks, guys.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Take it easy.